To get a context of this chapter 9, I want to go back to the ending of chapter 8. We looked at chapter 8 last week, and we come down to where the angel Gabriel explained much of what Daniel had seen in the vision. He explained to him about the ram and the he-goat, explained to him about the little horn, about the four horns, and about the little horn, and so on. But in verse 26, he said to Daniel, after explaining about Medo-Persia, Greece, and what would come next, the divisions of Greece into four, and then the little horn coming up and standing against the prince of princes and being broken without hand. And then he says to Daniel, and the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true, wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. Daniel fainted, and he was sick, and afterwards he says he rose up and did the king's business, and was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. None understood it because it was shut up. What was shut up was not Medo-Persia, Greece, the four horns and the little horn. What was shut up was the time period of 2,300 days, which was spoken about in verse 14. Now, I want to note something here. Daniel got this vision in verse 1 in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. We read in chapter 5 where Belshazzar had a feast and he was killed when the Medo-Persians came into Babylon and overthrew it. So Daniel's vision here in chapter 8 is taking place in the 3rd year while Belshazzar was still reigning. But if we go to chapter 9 says, in the 1st year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. Now Darius was the first person who was installed as king when the Medo-Persians took over. So we are seeing in chapter 8 the last of the Babylonian kings, Belshazzar, and we see in chapter 9 the first of the Persian kings, Darius. So what happened in chapter 8 was when Belshazzar's reign was coming. In the 3rd year of Belshazzar, I'm told that Belshazzar only reigned 3 years. And if in chapter 8 it was the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, then in the same year Belshazzar would have died and Darius would have taken over, which suggests to me that this chapter 9 here could have taken place in the same year when Belshazzar died. So the dream in chapter 8 could have happened in the same year when this other thing takes place in chapter 9. In the 1st year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Daniel is making a reference to something that Jeremiah the prophet said. Jeremiah said that Jerusalem would be desolate for 70 years. It said that Babylon would come and make a desolation of Jerusalem, and it would be like that for 70 years. So Daniel is making reference to that prophecy, and he says, by my hearing what Jeremiah said, by reading what Jeremiah said, I have come to understand that Jerusalem was going to be desolate for 70 years. His understanding by that, now remember that they were captives in Babylon and Jerusalem was at the time desolate. And so the reason he's coming up with this is because he's expecting that it's not going to go beyond 70 years. It would seem, based on the time when Medo-Persia took over from Babylon, the 70 years was almost finished. And so Daniel had a concern. So he said, I have understood from Jeremiah that it would be 70 years of captivity. And so he says, I set my face unto the Lord God to seek by prayer and supplications with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. And I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession and said, O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love him and to them that keep his commandments. We have sinned and have committed iniquity and have done wickedly and have rebelled, even by departing from thy precepts and from thy judgments. I want you to think carefully. I want you to follow me closely now. It's very important. Daniel says, I read Jeremiah's writings, and Jeremiah said we would be 70 years in captivity in Babylon. And so Daniel starts to pray, and one of the first things he says is, he says, I know we have sinned. I know we have committed iniquity, we have done wickedly and have rebelled from departing from the precepts and from thy judgments. And I'm not going to read all these verses, but he goes down the line and he continues by talking about it, and he says, he lambasts his own people and say, verse 8, to us belongeth confusion of face, to our kings, to our princes, to our fathers, because we have sinned against thee. So he's acknowledging the sin. And you know, when we talk to God, that's what we have been taught. You acknowledge your sins, acknowledge your wrongs first, and when you come to God. So he says, yeah, we have transgressed, and I'm going all the way down, because his prayer here is a fairly long prayer. It goes all the way down to verse 18. After he has outlined what they have been doing, he said, O God, incline thine ear and hear. Open thine eyes and behold our desolations, and the city which is called by thy name. For we do not present our supplications before thee for our righteousnesses, but for thy great mercies. And listen to this now. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, hearken and do. Defer not. For thine own sake, O my God, for thy city and thy people are called by thy name. There is a word in this verse that I want you to pay attention to. The word is defer. D-E-F-E-R. What does that word mean? To put off. And he's saying to God, God, I understood from Jeremiah that it would be 70 years we would be in Babylon, in captivity. That it would be 70 years that Jerusalem would be desolate. And I know we did all these wrongs and so on and so forth. But now we come down to verse 19 and say, God, I'm begging you, don't put it off. For your sake and for your city, Jerusalem, and for your people that are called by your name, don't put it off. Now, I want to put it to you that there was something that made Daniel believe that it was going to be put off. And I want to put it to you that that's something that made him believe that is found in chapter 8. Because in chapter 8, where the angel said to him, the vision of the evening and the morning, you must shut it up, because it shall be for many days. Daniel must have understood that to mean that he was going to be putting off the restoring of Jerusalem for 2,300 days. So Daniel went down in ashes and sackcloth and supplication to God, begging him, don't put it off. So let's go on. In verse 20, Daniel says, while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yea, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. Now, two things right here. Daniel said, while he's praying, he sees somebody who he saw before. He saw Gabriel in a vision before. That's what he says. And in chapter 8, we saw where Gabriel came, where the voice from heaven said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. And Gabriel explained it to him. And Daniel is saying, I see the same Gabriel come back now. And he touched me about the time of the evening oblation. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. In chapter 8 he had said, shut up the vision. And Daniel said nobody understood it. And so because Daniel didn't understand it and nobody understood it, Daniel comes now and he prays and he said, God, you said 70 years. You told Jeremiah it would be 70 years. And now it looks like it's going to be put off because you said 2,300 years. And Gabriel says, I am now come forth to give you skill and understanding. In other words, I come to help you to understand that thing that is troubling your mind. What was troubling Daniel's mind was the 2,300 days that he saw in chapter 8. And that's why he came begging God, don't put off the 70 years. Don't prolong it. Then Gabriel continues in verse 23 and he says, at the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth. And I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore, understand the matter and consider the vision. So while in chapter 8 Gabriel had said, shut it up because it is for a long time, now he says him get a commandment in heaven, and he has come to help Daniel to understand the thing that was confusing him. The thing that was confusing him was that same vision that was shut up. And so he says now, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. Now, Daniel was concerned about his people. Daniel's prayer, when you read it in chapter 9 here, was about his people. He said, we know that we are sinful. We know we did wrong. We know we did all these things. But God, don't defer it. Asking you, don't defer it for the sake of your name, for the sake of your city, Jerusalem, and for the sake of your people who are called by your name. Daniel did not understand what the 2,300 days were about. But Daniel, by reading it, understood it to be a long time. That it was not something to take place in the next few years. It is something for a far distant future. That's what it said in chapter 8. It is shut up until a far distant time. We're talking about 2,300 days here. 2,300 years. And he says 70 weeks are determined upon your people. In other words, 70 weeks out of the 2,300 years are determined upon your people and upon the city. Daniel was concerned about the people and the city. To finish the transgression, Daniel was praying about the transgressions of the people. To make an end of sins, he prayed about the sins of the people. To make reconciliation for iniquity, he talked about the iniquity that they had committed. And to bring in everlasting righteousness. So your people have 70 weeks in which these things are going to be brought to a culmination. And then he says, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. 70 weeks out of the 2,300 days will bring you to this happening. Then he says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. Now here's something Daniel was praying about Jeremiah, 70 years to the time of building Jerusalem. Now the angel is saying, when the commandment comes to go and rebuild Jerusalem, so when the 70 years are finished and that commandment comes to go build Jerusalem, you start counting from there. That's what he's saying here. From the time that the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So that will be 69 weeks. The street shall be built and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks, 62 weeks, shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined. So he's saying now, when the command comes to restore and build Jerusalem, you're going to start counting. And you count off 69 weeks, and you count 62 weeks to Messiah. And I have to go into more detail about this, but you count 62 weeks to Messiah, and then in the midst of the last week, the Messiah will be cut off. I didn't read that verse yet, verse 27. He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation. And that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Now let's understand this verse. He's talking about Messiah the Prince. I don't think we can have any question about who is Messiah the Prince. Messiah the Prince is Jesus. And it says, Jesus shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Now, clearly, it is not a 7-day week, because Jesus was around much longer than that. And verse, it says, in the middle of that week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Jesus caused the sacrifice, the system of sacrifices and oblations to cease when he died. When he became that sacrifice of God to save humanity, then all the sacrificial system, all the oblations, that came to an end. And so by his death, Jesus brought that system to an end. When Jesus died would be the middle of the week. And so what we see here in this, when Jesus started his ministry, when he started the work of his ministry, it was 27 AD. Jesus died in 31 AD. That's 3.5 years later. We recognize from that then, if that the midst of the week would be 3.5 years after the start. And therefore, since it's 3.5 years, and it says the midst of the week, then the middle of a week is 3.5 days. Because a week has 7 days. So if Jesus caused the sacrifice and oblation to cease 3.5 years after he started, then it tells us that it's counting a day for a year. This is prophetic time. And so what the reckoning is, 1 day equal 1 year. So we recognize now that the week in which he would confirm the covenant with many is actually 7 years. But in the middle of that 7 years, after 3.5 years, he would die, causing the sacrificial system to come to an end, causing the oblations to cease. It says, for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. My understanding of this is that the abominations that were present in Israel was rampant. They had got to the point where now they actually killed the Messiah. And the abomination was established in there. And so it says here, he caused the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and he makes the temple desolate. They were brought to desolation. Jesus said to the Jews when he was finished his ministry, he said, your house is left unto you desolate. Their house was left unto them desolate because they had turned their backs on the one who had brought salvation to them. 3.5 years after Jesus died, Saul of Tarsus was going around slaughtering Christians in the name of God. He was defending the church of the present time. The Christians, the disciples of Jesus, were seen as enemies, and Saul was there thinking he was doing God's service. And he was there consenting unto the death of Stephen. Saul headed off, Acts chapter 9 tells us, was heading down to Damascus to go and kill some more Christians. And Jesus met him. That's 3.5 years later. Jesus met Saul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus, and he was struck down with the brightness of Jesus coming. And we know the story. Jesus talked to him, and Saul was converted to Christianity, and Saul became the apostle to the Gentiles. It was at this point that he would be confirming the covenant with Israel, because the covenant was with Israel. And he was confirming the covenant with them up to that point in time. And then, as Paul now, the apostle to the Gentiles, moved out and carried the gospel to the Gentiles, the house of Israel was left desolate. Because the gospel, it was known that the church, the early Christian church, became the church of God. Israel as a nation, their usefulness came to an end. They were desolate. So it ended when the gospel went to the Gentiles. It was marked by both the stoning of Stephen and the conversion of Saul to Paul. So that's when the week came to an end. We can see very clearly where the gospel went to the Gentiles 3.5 years after Christ was cut off. So the covenant was confirmed with Israel because even then, remember that the apostles were at first in Jerusalem. They remained there, and up to the time of even Paul, they still had their little gatherings, their so-called general conference meetings and all that. But after Paul went to the Gentiles now, and also when Cornelius was affirmed by God, the gospel spread out and the covenant with Israel came to an end. But God had done his part of confirming it with his son for 3.5 years, and then with his disciples for the other 3.5 years, before actually taking it away from them and leaving their house desolate. Let me get now to an understanding of the 2,300 days. Because and this is the thing that seems logical and reasonable to me. I know that there are some views that say the 2,300 days haven't begun yet and it's in the future sometime. Now, here is my problem. If God gives a time period and it's not starting now, and he doesn't tell you when it will start, you will never know when it starts nor when it ends. Because if it just says sometime in the future, you don't know anything about that time period. So in chapter 8, when he said, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed or restored. When he said that, naturally, Daniel would have thought that it would be starting right then and there. So his people now are going to have to wait 2,300 years more for Jerusalem to be desolate. So Gabriel now, and that's why Daniel came praying about it, and God, don't do this to us. I know we're wretched and we're miserable and we're sinful and so on, but don't do this. Don't put it off, God. Jeremiah said that you said it would be 70 years. So don't stretch it out another 2,300 years. That's what Daniel was praying about. And Gabriel came to help him to understand, no. That's not what the 2,300 years is about. 70 weeks are determined upon your people. And to do all these things, 6 things there. Put an end of sin, bring in everlasting righteousness, and so on. Your people have a mission. God has made a covenant with your people. And they have a mission. And the mission was to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, Israel was given a covenant to do this. You might ask the question, how could Israel finish transgression? How could Israel make an end of sins? How could Israel make reconciliation for iniquity? How could Israel bring in everlasting righteousness? The mission of Israel was to bring the Messiah into the world. That was their mission. God had made a covenant with Abraham that in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. So God made a covenant that it is your offspring who are going to bring the Messiah into the world. And the Messiah is the one who would finish the transgression, who would make an end to sins, who would make reconciliation for iniquity, who would bring in everlasting righteousness. And when that happens, it will seal up the vision and the prophecy. Now, how does it seal up the vision and the prophecy? It's a vision of 2,300 years. And then you say 70 weeks are determined upon your people. 70 weeks out of 2,300 days amount to 490 days. 70 times 7. As we saw down in the last verse there, a day would be equivalent to a year, because when he said confirm the covenant with many for a week, it was with 7 years. And so we now have to translate everything into years. So 2,300 days would be 2,300 years. 70 weeks would be 70 times 7 years. So we're looking at 490 years. You have a period of 2,300 years and you take out 490 years out of it. What's left? What's left is 1,810 years. So when he says that this 70 weeks will seal up the vision and the prophecy, it's saying here that when you see the 490 years, now you're going to see this take place. You're going to see Messiah come and you're going to see him cut off and so on. At the end of that 490 years, it will seal the vision, because you take out the 490 out of the 2,300 and you know that the 1,810 is what left. Then you will know when it comes to an end. Now it says, verse 25, know and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince. So he said, start counting when that command goes out. So Daniel is concerned about the 70 years. And he says, when the command goes out to restore and build Jerusalem, that's when you're going to start counting the 2,300 years. The big arc across the top is showing you the 2,300 days. Across the top here. And then the 490 years is the first red arc right here. So the 490 years would end up in AD 34 when the gospel to the Gentiles, when Paul became the apostle to the Gentiles, when Stephen was stoned. So when you take out the 490 years from the 2,300 years, you're left with 1,810 years. And that 1,810 years would end up in 1844. And so that you start in 457 BC. But even if you don't know when it started, you know when that 7-year period is. You know Christ came in AD 27. You know he was killed in AD 31. And so the rest of the 3.5 years ends in AD 34. So you know that the time period ends, the 70 weeks ends in AD 34. So go backwards to find out when it started. Count back 490 years and you realize it starts in 457 BC. So you don't even need to ask when was the instruction given. Start from the end point of the 70 weeks. Start from the 490 years and go back 70 weeks. Go back 490 years and you're going to get the starting point. But what's even more important is we're going forward. Going forward, you have 1,810 left out of the 2,300. So you go forward and it goes to 1844. The real important question to ask is then, what is so important about 1844? What happened? Did anything happen? Because history, there's not much recorded there in history for 1844. So when he said, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed or restored, what was he talking about? And what evidence do we have that that took place then? Let's go back to chapter 8, just to get the full picture here. In chapter 8, and it's a little horn. So I'm going to start at verse 9 again. Out of one of them, that's out of one of the 4 horns that came up out of Greece, out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And it waxed great even to the host of heaven. It cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Something was happening here by this little horn, whoever or whatever he is, that he is affecting the host of heaven, God's people, and casting them down to the ground and stamping upon them. God's people were being decimated. But verse 11 says, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. The prince of the host is none other than Jesus himself. And so this little horn magnified himself up to the place of Jesus. So he's exalting himself to the place of Jesus. And by him, the little horn, the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. The place of Jesus' sanctuary was cast down. So this little horn had so much authority, so much power, so much vitriol in him, that he was able to even cast down the place of the sanctuary. And then now, I'm going to skip the next two verses because I want you to tie that back to the place of the sanctuary being cast down. He said unto me, verse 14, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. The place of the sanctuary was cast down by the little horn in verse 11, and verse 14 says, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now the King James Version says cleansed. Almost every other version, more modern version, says restored. Because what really happened is that the little horn cast down the place of Jesus' sanctuary, and verse 14 says it's going to be restored. What we would expect now is at the end of the 2,300 days, what the little horn cast down would be restored. Now, who would have done things like what we just read about here? Go back to verse 10 and 11. It cast down some of this host of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them, magnified himself to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down, and host was given him against the daily sacrifice, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. What I'm trying to do is to help you to understand what happened in chapter 8, and therefore what is supposed to happen at the end of the 2,300 days. In chapter 8 it says that this little horn did some terrible things against God, stamped upon the host. The host is God's people. The prince of the host is Jesus. So the little horn magnified himself to the place of Jesus, cast down the sanctuary of Jesus. Now where is the sanctuary of Jesus? In our hearts. So anybody or anything that turns your heart away from God will be removing the sanctuary of Jesus from you. History tells us that there is a religious institution that established itself to be in the place of Jesus. The head of that institution is called the Vicar of the Son of God, the representative of the Son of God. That's the Pope. He has put himself in the place of God, and so in that institution people were taught to go and confess their sins to the priests. But we are to confess our sins to God through Jesus. But this institution turned the heart away from God and turned them to earthly institutions. So men and women for over 1,000 years were there confessing their sins to other men like themselves. And these men like themselves had the effrontery to say that they would now be able to send them into heaven or bar them from heaven and make them into saints. So they had taken on themselves the prerogative of God. And so by doing that, they had removed the prince of the host. By doing that, they had removed the place of the sanctuary of the prince of the host. Verse 14 says, unto 2,300 days, that is going to be reversed. That is going to be changed. And if we know our history, we will realize that round about in the 1800s there, especially when the Great Awakening came about, people broke away, the Protestant movement broke away from the papacy, and they began to look to Jesus more. As a matter of fact, from before that, Luther, who was a part of the Catholic Church, he began to talk about justification by faith. So he began to help to break away this allegiance to this system. And so God, it wasn't just a one-day thing that it happened, but in process of time, God gradually did that. Now, what happened in 1844? Because of this expecting Jesus to come and the great disappointment when Jesus didn't come, of course, they had the wrong expectation. They didn't understand that it wasn't the sanctuary being cleansed or restored didn't mean that Jesus was coming. What it meant was that people would once again be led back into the right relationship with God through Jesus. But that disappointment served a purpose, because it caused people to dig a little deeper into the Word of God. And that it is from there that people began to move towards righteousness by faith. It is there that the hold of the papacy was broken. The hold of the little horn was broken, and the sanctuary was restored, was set back in place. So the restoring of the sanctuary doesn't mean that everybody is going to all of a sudden become perfect. It means that once again, Jesus is able to dwell in our hearts because we let him. There's no longer the priests and the prelates who are blocking that. And we no longer go to God through priests, earthly priests or pastors or anything. We go to God through Jesus, because it is only in Jesus that we have salvation. A lot of people tend to overthink this sanctuary being cleansed and restored. A lot of people think that when the sanctuary is cleansed, it means that all of a sudden everybody has become perfect. But that's not what it says. Daniel was thinking of the one in Jerusalem. And so that's why he was so worried. That's why he was so concerned, because whole 2,300 days more. But Jeremiah said it's 70 years, and we almost finished the 70 years now. So a whole 2,300 days more, a whole 2,300 years more. It tells you that Daniel also understood that it was not literal days he was talking about, but years. Because 2,300 days would be 6.5 years. So he wouldn't be so concerned. If he was thinking about Jerusalem, and if it was 6.5 years, he would have said, yes, we're going home. Time near. But because there was still another 20-30 years till the 70 years were finished. So he would have said, yeah man, we're going to go early instead, because just 6.5 years. But he understood that it was going to be a long period of time. And so based in that context now, and you can understand why Daniel would think so, because he said, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And so Daniel had this concern. And God sent Gabriel and said, Daniel, you are greater beloved in heaven. God don't want you to have this great worries on your head. So he sent me to explain to you. Only 70 weeks relate to your people. And he continued and explained. So it's not rocket science. It's not that very hard to see this if you get it. I don't know if anybody still is not clear on it. But one basic thing, I'm not going to all the other aspects of it. But 70 weeks are determined upon your people, ending in AD 34. So you can count backwards if you want to know when it starts. And after 70 weeks, after 490 years, you leave 1,810 years. That's when it ends. And what was to happen at the end of the period was that what happened in Daniel 8 here with the little horn was going to be reversed. People are going to again get back into the relationship with God. People are going to again talk to God directly, and not through priests and prelates. It was important for this to happen, because the little horn, the papacy, had so distorted people's relationship with God. The papacy had made it so that humanity no longer had a direct relationship with God. Imagine Jesus came to earth and died so that we can now come boldly before the throne of his grace. And this religious institution, the papacy, reverses it completely, so that anybody who even tried to go to Jesus directly would be put to death. They prevented people from reading the Bible. You had to go to priests, you had to go to prelates, you had to go to your cardinals and these people if you want to have a hope. And all these people dying in hopelessness, they couldn't read the Bible for themselves. And the priests and the people would go up there and read the Bible and put it how they wanted it. And so, when the Reformation took place, a lot of that began to be reversed. But round about 1800s now, when the great disappointment took place, when everybody expected Jesus to be coming at that time, and they all came together, and out of that came the time when all these breaking away from the papacy came together, and the denominations that came out of the 1844 disappointment, they no longer had these kinds of priests and so on. We had the Adventist movement that came out, we had the Jehovah's Witness that came out, we had the Church of God that came out, and so on. And they all repudiated. Not only did they repudiate that relationship, but they also repudiated this thing about the Trinity, because that is also a part of the deception that they brought upon Christendom about God being a Trinity, because that again helped to move Jesus out of the picture. Because if Jesus and God are the same, God doesn't have a son, and therefore you don't have a mediator between God and man.